And this is one of the big questions with impairment ratings. Okay, so it's the difference between an impairment and a disability. So an impairment is a significant deviation, loss, or loss of use of any bodily structure, bodily function in an individual with a health condition, disorder, or disease. So when we talk about impairment ratings, we're talking about a bodily function. A disability, activity limitations or participation restrictions in an individual with a health condition, disorder, or disease. So the key word there is activity limitations and or participation. So essentially we're talking about work. So the difference is, one has to do with the body, one has to do with the body relative to an activity. And the activity almost always we're talking about is work. So that's what disability. So you always associate disability with work and an impairment with a bodily function. And a really good way to memorize this is if a patient had the pinky finger, the very end phalanx of their pinky finger was crushed. Okay. And you go, okay, what would what would the impairment rating be, and what would the disability? Well, if it was a professional grand pianist and he had his baby finger distal phalanx crushed, okay, you go, okay, well, how big of an impairment rating is it? In other words, how much would that affect their ability to get dressed in the morning, bathe, shower, things like that? Well, it wouldn't. It pretty much wouldn't at all. Then you go, disability. Now, how big of a disability would that be? Well, it would be huge because he's a professional pianist and you would need your pinky. Okay. So that's a real simple way of thinking about the difference between an impairment and a disability. Now, you need to be aware that several times you'll be asked, sometimes the attorneys will ask for a disability rating, or you may have some other regulatory agency ask for a disability rating. And you need to be aware of the difference, number one. So if you're dealing with personal injury, it's almost always a mistake if they're asking for a disability rating. In other words, when you get somebody asking for a disability rating, especially relative to a personal injury, they almost don't know what they're asking for. In other words, they're not educated. They don't know what they're at. In other words, you need to be aware of that. And then you need to get back to them and say, now, wait a minute. Are you wanting a disability rating or are you wanting an impairment rating? Because an impairment is a bodily function restriction. A disability is a restriction relative to work. Very different things. So be aware of it. That happened a lot when I was in practice. They'll ask for a disability rating. And I'm like, no. That's not what you want. You want an impairment rating. And a lot of times, to be honest with you, they didn't know the difference. They didn't know the difference. That's why they sent it out and asked for a disability rating. So you just need to be aware that you've got to, anytime somebody asks you for a disability rating, you better get back with them and make sure they understand what they're asking for, because chances are they don't. So be highly aware of that. Okay. Now, when it comes to disability ratings, again, you're going to have to check with your state. In other words, if you want to do disability and for workers' compensation, you definitely want to check with your state. What are the guidelines or what are the needs for giving disability ratings? Because that's different. Remember, that's not an impairment. That's not an impairment rating. Remember, you can have a huge impairment like the baby grand pianist with a crushed, index or a baby pinky phalanx. And he's got a huge disability with no impairment. See? So make sure you're real clear on the differences of those. If you're dealing with personal injury, you're going to be dealing with impairment ratings, not disabilities. If you do want to do workers' compensation, that's when you're going to be dealing more with disability ratings. You need to contact the workers' compensation board and ask what their criteria is to give disability ratings. That, again, will differ per state. Who can give them? Some states require that you have to be certified in giving not only do you have to be a physician, or not a physician, but you have to be certified. Because a lot of times a disability rating can be an administrative function. An impairment rating is a physician function. And I don't recommend dealing with, unless you're going to get deeply involved with workers' compensation, because when you do disability ratings, you got to get familiar with jobs, with vocations, and what do they do? How much weight, how much standing do they do? How much sitting do they do? How much lifting do they do? How much, all the different movements relative to a particular vocation. That's a very different animal there.